When you're saying that the book of Isaiah,
Yeah.
that the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle.
They saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's
Wow.
something different that goes on there. Individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again, the interesting thing about Jesus is that we have more evidence from different writings in the ancient world.
So Joe Rogan and WES HUFF have the conversation about Jesus, the Big Bang, and Christianity. Let's get into it because this is the moment we've all been waiting for. Here we go.
If evolution is the only thing that created us, it's just evolution. How the But at the end of the day, you have one miracle. You have the Big Bang. All of science agrees this happened. That is so much crazier than anything that any religion is proposing, that it's so interesting to me that because we say we have echoes of the Big Bang. There's, radio echoes. Yeah, but also, if a miracle did take place, like, let's assume that there is actually a higher power that occasionally interacts with human beings. And if a miracle did take place and you were there, you don't have a camera, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have a pen, you can't write things down, maybe you can't even read. And you have this thing that happens to you, and this thing changes the course of human history. This thing changes the direction, the ideology that these people subscribe to, and the moral and ethical structure that they live their life by. It changes untold billions of human beings from that point on.
Yeah.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
That in itself, even if this is just a revelation without a divine interaction, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
It's a miracle that it was created at all. Like, the whole idea that Christianity, when you're saying that the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle. That's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
If you just imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later, pretty bananas.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples they think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead, we're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So what is your personal belief when it comes?
So he literally just said dead people usually don't rise from the dead. And one thing I wish Wes would say is, like, the Big Bang itself proves that there was a beginning in time. They used to think the universe was always existed, but that goes against what the Bible says. But the Bible says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Direction. What do you think happened? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think, so as a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So, but it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out. Literally the end.
Yeah.
Last couple of days. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in
Right.
you and I, right?
Right.
Like we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
Good point.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So,
How do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
well,
How many people saw his body, right?
well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the
500.
crucifixion.
No, saw the
He said it's 500, but
Saw the
resurrected
resurrection.
Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of, or the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus's ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And you go from a bunch of scared guys who, because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of
yeah.
individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case very recently where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead, and this guy started moving again and came back to life. It's a very, very bizarre case because his family had been told that he was going to be harvested for organs. They were preparing for that. And
Yeah.
this guy comes back.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion, and we
Pretty
know
brutal.
that, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing, atheist, agnostic Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity. So one of our earliest, in fact, not one of, the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross is called the Alexamenos Graphido. And it's probably from the end of the 1st century. And it's it depicts an individual with their arms raised in an act of worship, worshiping a man with a donkey's head who's being crucified. Whoa. And right beside it, it says Alexamenos worships his God in Greek.
Whoa.
And it's mocking, right? Because crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for like slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified.
Who was it that got crucified upside down?
Peter.
Why? Was it because like regular crucifixion wasn't good enough for him, or what was he? What didn't?
Yeah, he didn't want to be crucified. The story goes he did not want to be crucified the same way his Lord and Savior was crucified. But there's so much evidence for crucifixions. We found bodies that literally have been crucified with nails in their wrists or hands. And also, it's proven when Jesus was stabbed in the side and water and the blood was separated, that means like that's how we know a person is dead.
Because Christ had gone through it.
Well, so the story is that they say, we're going to crucify you. And he says, it's like too big of an honor to die like my Lord. And they say, well, we can fix that.
Oh, Jesus. Shut your mouth, buddy.
Listen, the Romans were pretty brutal.
Oh, yeah.
But this is why we know, like we have, it's interesting. We know a lot about crucifixion, but crucifixion was seen as so disgusting. I believe it was Cicero who said that like the word crucifixion shouldn't even be on a Roman man's lips. I mean, the word excruciating,
right.
X is off of in Latin, and crus, off the cross. So that's where we get that word, is because this was designed to humiliate, and it was designed to be as painful as possible. There was actually a really good article done by JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was done by a number of, I think it was in the 70s or the early 80s. It was done by a group of biblical scholars and then medical professionals. And so they looked at the conventions of what we do know about Roman crucifixion, and then they looked at the descriptions in the gospel to try to figure out, okay, if we could diagnose how Jesus died, how would he have died? And so they basically came up with this idea that he probably asphyxiated to death. You kind of drown in your own blood. But the chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine. I mean, if the first thing you do, if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's get me to a hospital, right?
Did they have them back then?
No, not really.
Also, are we entirely certain of their measurement of days?
So this is an interesting question because of the differences between when the Gospel of John says Jesus died compared to the Synoptics, because John appears to be using the Roman convention of counting time, and the other Gospels, when they describe the timing, appear to be using the Jewish ones. And actually, if you correlate between the two, they match up pretty well. So the thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day. So 3 days and 3 nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So
responding to a comment, Corpse says most survived for several days, but Jesus only lasted 3 days. Oh, you said 3 hours. Sorry. The problem is Jesus got whipped and flogged for a crazy amount. He literally didn't look like a human. Any normal human, they were saying, would have died from just the whipping alone. That's the thing. That was the problem.
So they deny that he actually had a physicality to him. This is sometimes called docetism, because dokein in Greek means to seem. So these groups that we describe as the docetics, they are denying that Jesus had a physical body. He only seemed to have a physical body. And they wrote documents later on. So the Gospel of Peter, which comes around in 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, is being written, and it has Jesus kind of chilling on the cross, because he's not really physical, because he's divine, and physical entities don't have physical bodies.
That's good, because you could see, guys, that the only time people were denying that Jesus didn't die or resurrect was 200 or 300 years after. But the earliest documents were saying Jesus is God, he really did resurrect, and he really was a real person. There was no one denying that because they had evidence. But later on, then people started coming up with their own stuff.
We don't actually get like a concrete denial of his resurrection in that way until you get things like the Gospel of Barnabas in the Middle Ages, which is it's actually the document that Billy brought up to me in the conversation we had, is the evidence that Jesus was never crucified, the Gospel of Barnabas. Well, Gospel of Barnabas is 15th century. It paraphrases Dante's Inferno. It's not an ancient document. So
that's funny. But
in the ancient world, nobody really had that big of a problem with these kind of supernatural claims. The more of the kind of skepticism was why you would worship a crucified individual to begin with.
Wow. So they were less surprised that he was resurrected.
Or that you would worship a crucified like teacher was just seen as silly.
Because it's so humiliating to be crucified.
Yeah, yeah. And that like a god would let himself go through this.
Right.
Like what are you talking about? In fact, the ancient world didn't really have a problem with supernatural events. There is an ancient writer who mocks Christianity, and he particularly mocks Christianity in saying that, of course, Jesus did miracles because Jesus had a childhood in Egypt. And he goes, all of those Egyptians are magicians anyways. So he just learned the magic when he was a child. Wow. So he actually confirms, incidentally, two things: that the narrative in the Gospels where it says that the Holy Family fled to Egypt during the reign of Herod, he corroborates that he actually thinks that happened and that Jesus did miracles. He just attributes the miracles to Jesus being a traveling magician anyways. And, anybody who lived in Egypt knows some magic.
That is what's really fascinating, that the mindset of the people that lived back then was that whatever was going on in Egypt was so crazy that they had to be magicians.
Yeah. Yeah, but everybody believed in supernatural events. Like, there's no such thing as like a secular work in the ancient world. Even Plutarch, who's one of the most famous biographers in the ancient world, he wrote 90 biographies, of which 60 still survive today. He was a priest of Apollo. So, like, he's already assuming that the gods exist, that crazy things are going to happen in the world. And so they didn't have a problem with people doing miracles or crazy things happening. Well,
that's also why it's so interesting trying to put your mind into the context of people that lived back then when you try to interpret what these stories were all about, because they did believe in things that weren't real. So when they talk about this thing that we're supposed to believe is real, when you have all this evidence that they believe things that aren't true.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I really like this part of Joe Rogan because he's actually explaining his thought process on things that are difficult for him. He's like, well, everyone believed in all these things that weren't true. So how are we supposed to believe in something that is supposed to be true, but everyone believed in things that weren't true? I really, really appreciate it.
Right? Because, like, you're now saying, yeah, but this one really was true.
Right.
Well, there's so many different things that they thought of and believed that weren't true.
Yeah. So this historiographically is, so when we do history, it's an inference to the best explanation. And so there are probabilities of things that have happened in history where we can say, okay, there's a higher probability of event A happening and a lower probability of event B happening. So the example I often give is like Jonah being swallowed by the fish. Like, that's low probabilistically, not that it didn't happen, but that, like, as a historian, we got to, like, say, well, there's no independent cross-reference sources. You don't have multiple attestation for this particular event. The interesting thing about Jesus is that we have more evidence from different writings in the ancient world than we probably should have for someone of his stature. Because we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, these 4 biographies. There's really only one other person in and around that time that can claim to have that much kind of independent testimony of their life, and it's the Roman Emperor Tiberius. So he also has 4 biographers. He has Cassio Dio, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Velius Paterculus. And so the Roman emperor, who's the most famous, most powerful person at the time, has a similar amount of historiographical evidence biographically for his, the events of his lifetime that Jesus does.
What is the interpretation of Jesus from non-Jesus followers at the time? Like, what did they think he was or who he was?
He was a crucified traveling rabbi.
That's
I mean, you have individuals like Josephus mentions him, end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. He was a Jewish Roman writer. Tacitus mentions him, who also wrote about the emperor. And, you have a number of these individuals, Cassio or Suetonius. But what they're doing mostly is describing what the followers of Christianity are saying about him. So you do have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt in that they're not saying things that they believe happened. They're talking about things that Christians believe happened. And Christians are this very unusual group because they're monotheistic in a world that does not believe in monotheism. And Jews are monotheistic in that time as well. But there was this idea that your religion could be tied to your ethnicity, and that was okay. Like, the Jews believe in one God, and that's weird, but they're Jews. Whereas the Christians start to convert people who are of all different ethnic backgrounds. And so they're like, well, what the heck is going on here? Because why are you saying... So the earliest criticisms of Christianity were actually that it was atheistic. Being the negative participle, and theos meaning God. Right? Because the ancient world was polytheistic.
Right.
But more than that, it was what's sometimes referred to as henotheism, in that...
That's so funny. And that's true. I've heard this. To think that people during that time thought that Christians were atheists because they only believed in one God, which is absolutely wild.
It's not that they believe in many gods. It's that they believe in many gods, and your gods could be my gods, right? Jupiter could be Zeus, just the same god by a different name. And your cities could have gods, right? Osiris and Ra can live in Egypt, and Zeus and Athena can live here, and that doesn't compromise anything. But then the Christians are coming around and they're saying, actually, no, none of those gods exist. If they exist, then they're demons, but they don't actually exist. And this was a big point of persecution within early Christianity, is that a lot of physical events were tied to supernatural events. So there's an ancient historian who has this line where he says, if
Bye, Mr. Split. Have a good one.
Nile River is too high in Egypt, or the Tiber River is too low in Rome, the cry will ring out the Christians to the lions. Because if you have a famine in Athens, and they're going, okay, what's the reason for the famine? Well, Athena's mad because there's a bunch of people running around saying she doesn't exist. Okay, well, let's deal with them. Let's
to the lions.
Yeah, let's get rid of them, and that'll solve our issue. So Christians were this very oddball group.
Kind of crazy that it wound up taking over the area.
Well, that's part of, I think, the argument of, well, how do you explain that? How do you explain it going from 11 scared disciples in an upper room to being willing to go out and die for the proclamation that you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and you saw him and you touched him and you ate with him, and you know he wasn't a ghost. You actually ate fish with the resurrected Jesus.
How does Constantine fit into this? Like, what is Constantine's education in Christianity?
Yeah, so Constantine is a pagan up until a point in time when he converts. So
who educates him?
Good question. I don't know in terms of his education. I know he does have some like crossover with some prominent Christians later on. He's a sun worshiper, but
That's crazy.
right before Constantine, you had a guy named Diocletian, who was the emperor, who basically had the goal of wiping out Christianity entirely. And so the worst point of persecution was under the Diocletian rule. He actually made it so that if you had to go into like the equivalent of your town hall, and you had to take a pinch of incense and offer it onto the altar of Caesar, him, right, the king, and say, Caesare Kurios, Caesar is Lord. And part of this was that they knew that Christians say, Jesus Kurios, Jesus is Lord. And Christians wouldn't do that. So here's how you outed them.
Oh,
And if you didn't do this, so if you did do it, you were given this piece of paper. It's called a libellus. And a libellus allowed you to buy and sell.
Wow.
If you didn't do it, you didn't get a libellus, which meant that you were not allowed to buy and sell.
Wow.
And so you have this incredible era of persecution where Christians are being like killed, and Christian literature in particular is being destroyed because they're hunting it out. Constantine comes after this, and he knows that this is bad for Roman society. And so him and Licinius get together. They're both ruling the Roman Empire at the time. And in 313, they put out this edict of tolerance, which includes Christianity. So it's called the Edict of Milan, and it decriminalizes Christianity. So it's no longer illegal to be a Christian.
What was their motivation?
I think they just felt like in order to establish peace within the empire, you need to make sure that people aren't fearing you constantly to that degree. And so it wasn't just Christianity that benefited from the Edict of Milan. A number of religious minority groups were benefited from this particular event. But this happens. Between 313 and 325, Constantine converts. And so he becomes friendly to Christians. He also, he commissions books of the Bible to be written. And so this is where we first get our understanding. Like when we think of a Bible, we think of it as like in a single bound volume. like because we have the 66 books of the Bible, and has a nice cover on the page or on the front. But in the ancient world, those existed independently. So like P52, like that would be a separate copy of the Gospel of John, and that's what it would have been understood as scripture. Well, Constantine, as like a peace offering, commissions all of these documents to be brought together and published in one book. Oh, and so we actually have what we think are some of these documents. So
Wow.
when I was talking with Billy Carson, he brought up the Sinai Bible, Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus is probably one of these documents that Constantine commissioned, because it's one of our earliest examples of a cover-to-cover, Genesis to Revelation copy of the Bible. And it comes from the 4th century. And based on both its dating and based on the fact that this would have been incredibly expensive to make.
Wow.
Like it took 360 sheep just to put together.
Wow.
Which would have been the equivalent of like, I don't know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars today. So the reason why we're pretty sure that documents like Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, potentially even Codex Alexandrinus or Codex Washingtonianus are documents that could have been part of this commissioning is just because they're such giant projects. Very few people would have had the ability to produce something like this other than an emperor. And so we actually have some of these documents that survive today.
All right. That's absolutely amazing that Joe Rogan is hearing about the gospel and that there's evidence for creator, there's evidence for Christianity, and we don't have to be afraid or think like this is all some conspiracy that Constantine put together to appease to the Christianity religion. But shout out to WES HUFF and Joe Rogan. Absolutely amazing, guys. So I encourage you to really look to Jesus. Know that he loves you. Know that he has given you purpose and a reason to live. It's absolutely amazing. I am so blessed. And you guys are blessed too.